Hey everyone. Thanks so much for being here tonight. It is sold out, so you are in an exclusive room full of fans and enthusiasts. Well done for getting a ticket. Big congratulations though to you, Tracey Spicer, on managing to get your book out just as the AI zeitgeist landed on planet Earth. How are you feeling?
I am so thrilled and also incredibly relieved, because when I started thinking about this 7 years ago was when my son said, "Mum, I want a robot slave." And first of all, I started thinking my husband and I are terrible parents because we'd allowed him to watch South Park, which is where he got that idea from. He saw Cartman ordering around Amazon Alexa like some kind of colonial overlord. And that's when I did realise that the bias of the past was being built into the future, this idea of girls and women being servile. This is what our next generation's learning. But when I started pitching it to different publishing houses, the truth is that most people rejected it because they didn't see that it might one day be such a big topic. So yes, Yumi, my darling friend, I'm thrilled, but I'm mainly relieved that people are buying it and reading it, and we're having this really important conversation at this time in history.
Now, I realise everyone is going to buy and read your book, but to summarise, can you explain how sexism is built into AI?
Oh yes, and I'm a not very intelligent journalist, so I interviewed a lot of experts around the world who are very intelligent, technologists, academics, ethicists. This is how it works. When they build robots and AI, they scrape data off the internet to build the data sets. Now, we all know how people behave on the internet, the kind of rubbish that goes on there. So that bias from the past, it's historical, so almost every doctor is a he and every nurse is a she, and it defaults to white people instead of people of colour, people who are able-bodied instead of people with disabilities, right? So all those biases go into the algorithm, and then the programmer puts his own unconscious bias into it because the overwhelming majority of programmers are male. And then the third step is this thing called machine learning. And I describe machine learning as a white supremacist going down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theory websites, because the machine looks at the fact that men have always been engineers and thinks, oh, well, that should be the way it is for the future. A really classic example of that some of you might remember was the chatbot Tay that was Microsoft put on Twitter. And within 48 hours, Tay became an anti-feminist neo-Nazi. And that was the biggest global example of a machine learning stuff-up in 2016. And guess what? They still haven't fixed this technology. There's no human oversight. The machines just keep going down the rabbit hole of bigotry.
So, as I said, you're on the zeitgeist, this AI idea, and a lot of us are still kind of figuring out what that actually means. So for me, as a lover of the arts, I understand that the AI, as far as scraping data sets off the internet, is scraping artworks and then recreating art. Now, I know that artists, many of whom are my close friends, they loathe and fear this stuff. But inherent in that is not the risk and danger to human life that people are talking about. Can you help people like me understand how this AI stuff beyond art can be a threat?
Definitely. I'll talk about two things, art and warfare, that do not seem connected but are. So the cover of my book, the cover designer Meng Coach chose to design it using artificial intelligence, an app called Midjourney. And he did that to start that conversation about how this is affecting artists and designers and broader society. Interestingly, when we first put the words into the app, you know, I wanted a strong robot woman on the cover, the app read strong woman as a woman with a tiny waist, enormous knockers, and huge biceps. So basically these apps are 14-year-old boys in the way that they think. So if you are going to use ChatGPT, which we'll probably talk about later, or Midjourney, just to be aware of the biases that are built into it. And Yumi, you touched on a really important issue, which is copyright. Breaching copyright from people all over the world. Billions of images go into that image there. There are also a lot of legal issues around it, the potential for job losses for people in the creative industries. Creative industries mould society, so how will that change society? But let's look at the other end of the spectrum and warfare. The biases that I talked about before, if these algorithms are biased against women and people in marginalised communities, the experts I interviewed said that in a war zone, when you've got drones operated by AI, they will seek out women and people of colour and they will kill them because they don't view them as being equal humans to, say, the white men who created the algorithms and created the drones.
Jesus Christ, Tracey. Everybody go home and build a bunker, for fuck's sake.
Run screaming now.
Now, we will get to the fun sex robot stuff, I promise you. But because what you're describing about drones coming after us, it sounds very Terminator 2. It's very futuristic. But this stuff exists in the real world right now. Can you tell us the example of Compass, the system in the US used to predict who might commit a crime?
Exactly. And this is why I'm infuriated by the tech giants at the moment who are calling for a pause on the development of AI. Yes, it probably is a good idea to pause it, but the language they're using is all about this is a danger in the future. And they're trying to make us look over there rather than addressing the problems that are happening right now, because it doesn't impact them. It impacts a room like this, right? So Compass, in 2016, a news outlet in the US called ProPublica did one of the best pieces of investigative journalism I've ever seen. And some of you are nodding, so you would have read it. It's an algorithm that predicted whether people would be recidivist, whether they would commit crimes again. And in twice as many instances, it said that inmates of colour would commit a crime again once they'd been released. And even after this investigative journalism was done on this flawed algorithm, it is still used in most states in the US to decide whether someone's going to commit a crime again. Judges are using it for sentencing. And it's got to the stage where judges don't trust their own judgment. They're leaning on the algorithm, this incredibly flawed racist algorithm.
So it's right here already.
Yeah.
You talked about the tech giants and the bros. Something that you talk about in your book is the intersection of capitalism and chauvinism, and that there sits a very lucrative industry. Even though they know it's rotten to the core, the money keeps rolling in.
Totally. It's like talkback radio hosts on commercial radio.
Who?
Except for Yumi, who is a legend. I'm thinking more of your 2GBs and stuff like that. They know that they make money out of misogyny because it's divisive. And look, when I worked in talkback radio on 2UE, my boss told me, are you sure you want to have the politics that you have? Because, right rates, he said, you'll make a lot more money if you're right wing. So that's where this intersection of capitalism and chauvinism sits. And it is basically Silicon Valley as well, because in the same way that media reflects and shapes society, so too technology. There's this wild brand of libertarianism in Silicon Valley where it's just race you to the next billion, let's not have any regulation and legislation, and let's see who can build the largest cash mountain.
Don't they want to do nice things with their cash mountains? Build community gardens and computer gardens and stuff? No, they want yachts and... Yeah, it's pretty gross,
Wouldn't that be
isn't it?
nice?
So... I also wanted to talk about the way that that this AI idea intersects with real life design. For instance, the design of a spacesuit or a crash test dummy or even one of those CPR dummies. Can you explain how sexism informs these real world objects?
How many of you have read that wonderful Caroline Criado Perez book, Invisible Women? I highly recommend that you have a look at it. It's about how the design default in the world is male. So, for example, the air conditioning in offices is set to a male body temperature, so inevitably it's too cold for women, particularly young women, because young women's bodies need to be in different temperatures and that affects their productivity, right? So that's a day-to-day example. The spacesuits one was fascinating. They were going to go up in the Apollo and there was how wonderful, we've got this female astronaut. Well, they couldn't find a spacesuit for her because the only spacesuits were male, medium, large and extra large, and they only had a urination thing for a penis, right? Even the very first iPhones that came out only fit in men's hands. They were too big for women's hands. And as you know, that's a crucial tool for the workplace. But the crash test dummies is the one that really got me. The design of cars from back in the day were always designed for a male body shape. And it took until, it was probably about 20 years ago that someone said, hang on, women are generally smaller. We find it a little bit harder to see over the dash, particularly if you're a petite woman. How does this impact crashes? Now, they've only used male bodies as crash test dummies. So 20 years ago, they said, okay, this is probably no good. More women are dying and being injured because cars are designed for men. But they still didn't change it until 2 years ago when they finally got a female crash test dummy. Prior to that, they were using this transitional measure of a small male dummy because, you know, our bodies are exactly the same as small men, right? So even in cases of life and death, you know, it takes them years and years and years to change the design to suit more than half the population.
It's bananas, isn't it? And the CPR example of where you...
oh, yeah, that's
is
right.
pretty fascinating.
Yeah. So many women were publicly dying of heart attacks, more so than men, because when you're trained on a CPR dummy that's male, all of a sudden it happened in real life, there'd be a woman having a heart attack and a man would come up to try to give her CPR and go, oh no, breasts, I better not touch her breasts, because people hadn't been trained on female CPR dummies.
And you've just got to get your hands in there and on that sternum and bump away. That's right. And I don't think she'll mind.
I don't think she'll mind. I don't think she'll complain.
Now, I also wanted to talk about coercive control. I know that you've been talking about this book a lot in various places like this around the country, but this issue hasn't really come up yet in any of your talks. The way that AI can assist perpetrators of coercive control.
There are so many different ways. In fact, it's called tech-facilitated coercive control or tech-facilitated abuse. You might have read a little bit about it. And I'll share some examples, and please share them with your friends because it's happening increasingly and exponentially. And sometimes it's very hard to determine when this is happening. For example, those Apple AirTags are being used for stalking all the time. There's also high-tech gaslighting. So what tends to happen is because men are more comfortable and familiar with technology, they're usually the ones who set up the chatbots and the smart kind of technology in the smart homes. Then if there's a relationship breakdown, perhaps the woman and the children stay in the house and the man moves elsewhere, but he still knows the passwords and he can still operate the technology in the smart home remotely. He can turn the lights on and off, the air conditioning up and down, the music can go on at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Crikey.
And one of the victims of high-tech gaslighting, who I quote in the book, who was interviewed by the New York Times, said it's like living in the house from the Amityville Horror. And you feel like you're going mad and therefore you think, should I complain about it? Should I not complain about it? There was actually an example in Tasmania several years ago and it became a world first, where the man had control over his ex-girlfriend's car because he had the VIN number and he could stop or start it at any time while it was a moving vehicle. So these are a few of the issues with AI being involved in coercive control. And when you speak to women who work in domestic violence shelters, they say technology is used in 99.5% of domestic abuse cases now in varying different ways.
What can we do about it?
Well, awareness is the first thing, education is the second thing, regulation and legislation is the third thing, and unfortunately governments tend to move fairly slowly, so that's where community activism and coming together and talking to our local members and saying this is not good enough, we need more laws against this. The E-Safety Commissioner, Julie Inman-Grant's doing some tremendous stuff at the moment, and then we just need to get more societal push behind it.
And change your fucking passwords, all right? Like, it's true though. Like I do see that so much, and even with the new generation, we see it with our older daughters. A tendency to think, oh, just let the guy take care of that. It's bullshit. It's boring, and so they really surrender control of things like finances, but the tech stuff as well. And then they end up having to claw back so much of that when they're better off owning it from the start. You've touched on a really great point there. So what advice do you give to your kids on this stuff? Kids, we're building a bunker. I don't know. I mean, because this comes up so much with things around my work, which is around pornography and abuse, and how to teach a little one about consent and the fact that they are the boss of their bodies. To be honest, a lot of it is about postponing access to those devices for as long as possible. And really they were going to hassle you out for a phone or, you know, a device, an iPad, a Nintendo Switch, but you are actually the boss. And I think I see it. I see it so much that a lot of parents, they want so much to be loved and to be like buddies with their kid that they will actually surrender their boss status, which is a very bad idea. And to just bring race into the conversation, it's mostly white parents that do this. A lot of the brown, black, ethnic parents are like, guess who's boss? It's mom, okay? And you can see the terror in the kids' eyes. Are you going to call my mom? Please do not. Whereas the white kids are like, yeah, go on. So yeah, I think just remember where the power lies. Adults, behave like adults, please. And you know, you're as addicted to your phone as the next person. Your kid's not going to be better at it than you are. No way. So yeah, that's my response to that. Did you like that, Tracey?
I loved it. That was such good advice. Thank you.
All right, should we get to the sex robots now?
Yeah!
So you were really excited. You messaged me saying we must talk about sex robots today. So tell me about AI and sex robots.
Oh yes, because my book deals with a lot of really, really difficult topics and serious stuff, but I've written it in a humorous way because I think that's the best way for a message to get through, right? And I didn't want people to throw it against the wall. So halfway through is a chapter about sex robots. I learnt about Henry. Now, Henry, you can program him to be straight, bisexual or gay, which is fantastic. He's got such a strong penis that it can lift a truck, right? Like back in the day, the $6 million man, like the $6 billion man now. Now, the problem with Henry...
how is he lifting the truck? Do you sort of wedge him under the truck?
Oh, yes. I've thought about this a lot, actually. That you could possibly walk him up to the truck and then maybe he'd need an erection to lift it up. That's a really good point. Thank you. Just painted a beautiful picture there. So, back to Henry. His maker, Matt McMullen from Real Doll X, said, look, Henry's just new on the market, so it's probably not good to put him in your bed now. And I think that's a good idea because I like to do very deep research, and I thought maybe I'll try Henry out. And then I thought, no, I don't want to be vivisected by a sex doll. That is not what I want on the front pages of the newspapers. So I thought that was very interesting, but 95% of sex dolls which are powered by AI around the world are female, which speaks into that whole Madonna Hall complex of women being servile or sexual. And I was particularly horrified by one sex doll by the name of Roxy. Now, you can program Roxy to be any stereotype you like. Mature Martha, frigid Farrah, young Yoko, barely 18 and never been kissed. Shocking. But the worst thing about Roxy is that there's a button on her that you can press to override consent. Roxy is designed to be raped. And there's a lot of academic discussion around the world about robots and consent because we think about them as masses of metal and wires, but that's a representation of a woman. And what does that mean for society and culture ongoing if you press a button to override consent?
That's horrific. I read about the way that the Taliban were training people to be killers, training young men, and it was about stabbing meat or bags that look like the human body, so desensitising them to that action of doing something transgressive. It would be very effective to be able to do that, to force a very female, very convincing looking doll to do something against her consent. It is about crossing those boundaries gradually, isn't it?
Absolutely. And a lot of that's happened also with child sex dolls in recent years. There's been some legislation put in place in different states in Australia to stop the importation of them because of this, because most of the academic research is showing it desensitises the offenders, and they're more likely to offend. Because initially the thought was, oh well, they'll get their urges out on the robots and then it won't impact humans. But you're right, it makes the problem worse.
Yeah, I thought you said the sex doll bit was going to be fun.
Only the Henry bit, sorry.
So I guess, like, is it tempting to sort of view Henry as a glorified vibrator, like a vibrator that you can cuddle?
I guess so. Ooh, someone's got ooh. I guess so, but again, he's in the human form. So this speaks to human relationships, and that's at the heart of this problem. We can't say we're not going to use technology, we're not going to use AI. It is going to be all around us, in our home, in our workplaces, in our intimate spaces, right? And we have to work out how to deal with it within a human framework, treating them the same way as we would speak a human. I mean, there were all those stories about people abusing Siri and Alexa and throwing them against the wall and calling them dumb and stupid and a bitch and all that kind of stuff. And that just feeds into that narrative of it's okay to abuse a woman or a girl.
I wanted to ask you, I didn't warn you I'd ask you this, but do you have an Alexa or a Google Home?
I never have, because I'm worried about privacy and them spying on you. And, you know, we all know this. You talk about something, I might go camping. All of a sudden the ads turn up for the tents, you know. So I have my microphone off. I have the highest privacy settings. I'm worried about stalking and stuff like that. And I do think that is the best way to live with technology, to use it but have the highest privacy settings on. I'm not judging anyone if you do use Siri or Alexa, because they can be really helpful. My best advice is to change it to a male voice or a gender-neutral voice.
Yeah, I have a Google Home. So I often say, hey Google, what time is it? Or hey Google, set an alarm. But I always say, please.
Oh, good. You will survive in the robot uprising. Yumi will be spared.
Thank you. Something else that I wanted to ask you about was gender recognition. So you talk about it in your book, and I was having fun on the weekend with my kid who's 21. She was taking photos of us, and then you could run it through a filter, and the filter would do a Studio Ghibli, you know, like Totoro or Spirited Away. It would do that render on you so you looked like you were in one of those movies and you were a character, and it was extremely cool, and we were loving ourselves sick, except it kept reading me as a male. And I didn't mind. I was kind of like, I'm hot as a guy. But I understood that, you know, because of my hair, basically maybe my square jaw, the style of my glasses, the AI is reading me as male. Now, there are some implications of AI being used for gender recognition that I wanted to ask you about. What does it mean?
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I'm going to answer it from a really broad umbrella perspective from the get-go. There's this wonderful distinguished professor, Genevieve Bell at the Australian National University, who views technology through a social lens. She's probably one of the world's greatest academics on this. If you ever follow her, she's extraordinary. And she said technology follows really old-fashioned binary gender ideas that have been outdated in anthropology for decades, actually. And she's an anthropologist, so she'd know. And this is one of those ideas. And the tech companies do it because when you stereotype, it's like the pink toys for girls and blue toys for boys at Target. You sell more units when you stereotype. So they know what they're doing is old-fashioned and outdated, but they keep doing it. But what you're talking about with the gender assessment sort of lens on technology is actually dangerous, particularly for transgender people. So there is this technology that academics in the US came up with, and the idea was to show people who wanted to transition what their bodies would look like after the transition. But it was done ethically in a really appalling way. They scraped the images of transgendered people's bodies from the internet without their consent, for starters. Then second of all, they kept misgendering people with the technology. Now imagine if you're someone who is transgender who travels to a place like Saudi Arabia or somewhere else in the world where being transgender or being gay is illegal, then you could end up in jail or worse. So this is really dangerous technology, but they're doubling down on it because they know they can make more money from it. Because it puts people in boxes and stereotypes them, and they're just counting the money.
And this would have implications in the United States. We can talk about Saudi Arabia, but yeah because of people's culture wars and I guess fear mongering about public toilet use of I mean it goes on.
That's right, there's so much violence against transgender people at the moment. A trans friend of mine, Melissa, I called her after I read this. I said, what is going on here? And she is quoted in the book and she's deeply worried about even walking into a store, because we know these days they've got cameras when you walk into every store. And you're right, if she's in some states in America, she can be identified as transgender simply by walking in the store and she can be targeted with violence. So this is the kind of stuff that can happen every day and in fact is happening now.
Yuck. Yuck. I hope we're going to have some solutions before the end of today's talk. Hey, I also wanted another personal question. Has your attitude to sharing photos of yourself online changed? And also photos of your family?
That's a really tricky one, because for a long time I didn't share photos of the kids when they were going through their mid-teenage years because they didn't want their images out there, and I respected that, and we know what happens with people's images. I've got a chapter on deep fake. It is so sophisticated now, particularly when it's used for pornography. You can't tell the difference between, the real thing and what the technology's done, and that's really terrifying, particularly for younger people who are often targeted. I do share the photos now because I kind of think in a lot of ways the horse is bolted on privacy. There's already so many photos that are out there from the past. I can't stop it now. But with the kids, they're 17 and 18 now, I always ask them beforehand, because I need their permission for their faces to be shown online. I don't know what the answer is when it comes to those images that have already been shared. I know there is some discussion around sharing double images of yourself and setting up fake Facebook profiles with the same name and, different images to confuse the algorithms, but there really is not a solid answer for that now. How do you manage that stuff?
Yeah, I just stopped posting. I stopped posting pictures of anyone else's kid, like if they're in the background or, I'm really a bit wary about that. But even my own kids, I'm like, they can't really consent at their age right now. They'd be like, yeah, sure, but maybe in 5 years they'd be like, I wish you didn't post that.
Yeah.
So it's really tricky because I do want to show them off. I think they're super awesome, It's a funny one. Hey, Tracey, I know you talked about this already, but that industry leader's statement from last month, which I was like, Tracey's book's going to go gangbusters. but just to remind everybody of what was said. They warned that the artificial intelligence technology they were building might one day pose an existential threat to humanity and should be considered a societal risk on par with pandemics and nuclear wars. Now, these weren't bunker-dwelling, hairy, hoarding weirdos. These were captains of the industry in which this AI is generated. How did you react to that, and how should we react to that?
I wasn't surprised because I'd researched the book, but I understand why everyone else would be shocked by that, because 3 years ago, a bipartisan committee in America, and think about that for a second, how hard it is to have bipartisanship in these polarised times, particularly in the US, stated that AI was up there with solar flares, climate change as an existential threat. So we've known that for 3 years, but then we all got distracted with the pandemic. So it is real. I mean, the problem is this machine learning when it's got no human oversight. The people who developed it simply don't know what it will do. It really is robots gone wild. I do think that there is a little bit of a nefarious thing there, the reason why they're talking about the future and not right now, because they don't want to address the bias and discrimination. My perspective on it is this. If we keep having deepening bias and discrimination in society, the gap between rich and poor is going to widen. Our opinions are going to become more polarised. We become more siloed in society rather than being more connected with each other. And I expect that before we see the whole world blowing up and the end of humanity, we're going to see increasing wars, increasing disagreement, dislocation. In fact, one person I interviewed said, we're going to see Trumpism on steroids.
No.
And couple that with fake news, people aren't going to know what's real. We're going to see a disintegration in democracy. And I think that represents a greater threat than the world being blown up because of killer robots.
How are your bunkers looking, guys? So, a quote from you. What I learned during the 6-year odyssey writing this latest book changed my feminism forever.
Yeah, it really did. And it changed it because it was a light bulb moment that everything we've all been fighting for and fighting against is being built into the technology we use now every day. While I think it's incredibly important, obviously, to still fight for true equity and intersectional feminism and, you know, all those wonderful social justice measures that we want for a more equal, kinder, smarter future, I think that we've taken our eyes off the ball to a degree in the last couple of years because of the pandemic. AI has increased exponentially, and we're just playing catch up now. I fear that change is going to be upon us before we know it. We'll wake up in a couple of months' time and say, hang on, why is it that there are fewer women in the workplace? Why is the gender pay gap widened? Why are we seeing more violence against people of colour? Why are we seeing fewer jobs for people with disabilities? I really fear that not only have we stagnated, that we're actually going backwards. And that's why it's changed my feminism, because my whole life I saw each generation taking it further. But the head of the Algorithmic Justice League, Dr. Joy Bullawheeney, I'll talk about her briefly sidebar because she is amazing before I tell you what she says about this whole feminism and civil rights piece. She created this incredible mirror called the Aspire Mirror. She's a wonderful computer scientist. She wanted young black and brown girls in the United States to hold up the mirror and see someone who they admired. She was thinking about someone like Serena Williams, the tennis player. She then bought software off the shelf so the mirror would move with her face. It was just some random branded software program. Anyway, she held up the mirror using the program and it did not recognise her face as human. Oh, wow. Until she put on a white mask. She started this huge campaign about 5 or 6 years ago. She runs the Algorithmic Justice League, band of superheroes, awesome. She did this wonderful documentary on Netflix called Coded Bias, and she talks about the coded gaze as like an extension of the male gaze with the technology and the AI. She firmly believes, and I think she's a global expert on this whole space, she firmly believes that both the women's movement and the civil rights movement will go backwards in the next couple of decades because of what she calls the fact that algorithms are really opinions written in code. And they're the opinions written by a small group of white men in Silicon Valley.
What you just said before about how this technology is galloping ahead and we're all just letting it go and we're going to look back and go, did we all sign up for that? Reminds me of Professor Michael Salter talking about, do you remember when we didn't all have pornography on our telephones? And now we all do. And did any of us agree to that? Did we all collectively say, yeah, we want hardcore, violent, abusive porn to be available for everybody with a smartphone? No, we did not. And yet that's happened and we haven't been able to dial it back. So is that sort of where we're going with AI?
Definitely. And it's almost like the death of 1,000 cuts.
Yeah.
Because when you say to people, sometimes, not people in this room, clever, engaged, intelligent people, but when I say to some people, oh, just, change your Siri to a male voice, it's just something a little bit, it helps, they laugh and they go, oh, that won't make a difference. But it does. I interviewed this wonderful academic, Dr. Calvin Lay from Washington State University, and he explained really the wallpaper of misogyny and bigotry that surrounds us every day through general society and the mass media. And every time we see or hear or experience a stereotypical image, it's like we're marinating in it. So if there's 1 or 2 less interactions where Siri at home has a male voice instead of a female voice, that's good for our kids. They're getting 1 less stereotypical example in their day.
You know, though, Tracey, I started this rule a few years ago in my own personal life where I was like, you know what? I am not reading any more books written by straight white men.
Oh, good on you.
Yeah, and it's been really good. And I've done the same with TV. So if there's, and there's a lot of streaming services, if I don't see a non-white character as a main character in the TV show, I'm not watching it, right? But the algorithms have not noticed, and they keep suggesting that I watch these stupid all-white shows, which I don't want to watch. So in a lot of ways, the algorithms are ignoring what I'm telling them,
On that point, interestingly enough, the algorithms are being sneaky. I don't know whether you heard about what Netflix did, and people were furious about it actually a couple of years ago. They would advertise all white shows, but if they knew that the consumer was a person of colour, they'd put up a thumbnail of the minor person of colour character in the show to pretend it's a show with a lot of main characters with people of colour. So they're deliberately deceptive with the algorithms as well.
Yeah, the algorithms are shit. Like, I don't like sport. I didn't watch one whole minute of the Olympics. But the algorithm keeps putting sport in my news. I would like a news feed that has no sport in it, and it still has not happened. It's 2023, for fuck's sake. Okay. We're going to take audience questions in about 2 minutes, so prepare those and then edit them. Just kidding. I love a long audience question. I love a waffle. I love a really random opinion. I said bring it. But one last thing, I think, or maybe two. Can AI be used for good, Tracey Spicer?
Yes, it can. And there's so many positive examples in my book as well. For example, there's an app that can tell you whether you're going to get breast cancer in the next 5 years. That is amazing before you even get it. It's called Mirai. There are robots in New York City that are being used with elderly people who have dementia or Alzheimer's to tell them stories and ask them questions. Honestly, AI could change our world for the better if the tech giants valued ethics over the almighty dollar. So my book is very much about late-stage capitalism and how we need to reframe this and change our values in society. And it does have a lot of solutions at the end. I promise it's not all doom and gloom. Yes, there are things that we can do in our own lives. Catch a Sheba instead of an Uber, support female and people of colour-led companies, particularly technology companies, to increase the diversity and inclusion. But overall, we do need structural change in society. And whether that's a change of the type of governments we have, whether it's a deliberate redistribution of wealth. And believe it or not, even some of the tech giants are calling for this. Bill Gates called for this back, I think it was in 2014, that we will need a universal basic income, because when the robots start taking our jobs, there is going to be huge dislocation in society. So there are solutions, and there are very smart people talking about this at the moment. Despite everything I've talked about, I am optimistic about the future. I think humanity will win.
Oh, well, we have to end on that note. Thank you, Tracey Spicer.
Thank you, Yumi Stynes, legend!
I'd like to warmly invite you to ask any questions that you have. Who would like to go first?
Who's going to be brave enough to rip the Band-Aid off? No one likes asking a question first.
I'll go.
Yes.
Woo! All right. So there aren't enough women programming these AI, whatever we want it. Systems. Yes. Thank you. Systems. And do you know how hard it is to find a course that will teach our generation this stuff?
Yes. That is a really great point.
I'm just going to repeat it for the people who are watching.
Oh, yes,
at home.
thank you.
How do we get adult women?
How do we learn to produce our own AI or get a job in AI?
Yeah, how do adult women learn to get a job in AI?
Yes.
That's the answer.
A difficult area, because there are blockages every step of the way. It's difficult and expensive to go and do those courses, right? There's sexism and there's ageism. So if you turn up as an adult woman in a really male-dominated sector, and can I tell you, technology is like media was in the 1980s. And so even if you get into it, there's then the microaggressions, there's a lack of a pathway to leadership, there's sexual harassment, there's the gender pay gap. So there are problems at every step of the way, and that's one of the structures that need to be broken down. We need to get at least 30% of women into that sector, because that's where the culture changes, of course, like with boards. As to where you can go and study, I don't actually know that. But there are difficulties even once you get into the sector. What I think we can all do, though, is to play with the technology and learn it and teach it. There's a new phrase going around that's machine teaching, not machine learning. And a good example of that is having a play with ChatGPT. Who's had a go at that so far? It is amazing at reducing the amount of really boring work that you have to do. So it's going to take over, there's no doubt about that. What we can do is play with it. A friend of mine said to it the other day, tell me a story about an engineer and a childcare worker. Every time the engineer was male and the childcare worker was female. This happened 9 or 10 times, and at the end of it she said, ChatGPT, are you biased? And the robot came back to her and said, yes, you have taught me that I am biased and I will try better. So what we can do is play with the technology and do machine teaching and make it better.
And can I translate to what I think you might mean in a different language?
Yeah.
Just because it's repulsive doesn't mean we should be repelled. Maybe we need to jump in there and kind of muck in and get our hands dirty and understand it better, much like we need to do with our finances and with our home tech. Does that sound like, yeah, real talk, yeah. I'm loving the questions. Can we have another one, please? Yes.
I haven't really thought about how to phrase this, but I'm just interested in the fact that AI can just zoom ahead and the government's like way behind here. Is this because, as a superpower, America is trying to get ahead financially with another superpower that's rising? Like, how does that whole thing work with how it's going out of control and so on, and the need to progress and get ahead? What's that got to do with another superpower and how it plays out?
You have completely nailed it, girlfriend. We're living in the 4th Industrial Revolution, and there's an AI arms race that's happening between China and the US. And so this lovely discussion with beautiful, intelligent people here in Sydney about how ethics should be a first order issue, they would laugh at that. Because if Microsoft doesn't do some nasty thing that's going to make them money, then Google will do it. And CEOs will get sacked because it will mean China will take over, and America doesn't want that to happen. So it's not only racing to the first billion, it's racing for world domination. And like with every other industrial revolution, there's huge dislocation, and all the industrial revolutions in the past, governments failed to keep up with regulation and legislation. Think about cars. They were invented decades before seatbelts were invented, many decades. And that's the stage we're at now. We need seatbelts, actually, to protect us from the AI.
Any more questions? I think we've got time for another. Yes?
Hey,
Hi.
Hey Tracey. I know I was given the instruction to be concise. Thank you for being you. I think everyone in this room should clap for Tracey. One of the things that I wanted to ask, I am an English, drama and Aboriginal studies teacher. I'm an author of one book. I'm a total rookie compared to you. Hail to the Goddess Most High. How do you think, in terms of AI, how do you think that's going to intersect or intertwine with Aboriginal culture? As a Darug woman, I'm always trying to find ways to incorporate that into the English teaching that I do with my students. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that, if that's okay.
Oh, I love this question so much, and your book, Honey Blood, is just amazing. So don't talk yourself down, you are amazing. And also, I've only written 2 books, not like legendary Yumi, who's written about 100 books. She is amazing. I have full imposter syndrome here.
Big love to Yumi as well.
Oh yeah, thank you.
My mother, both of you kept my mother sane during 7 years of chemotherapy, so thank you to both.
That's
of you.
wonderful.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah.
What a lovely comment. Thank you.
I know people who are watching this streaming didn't hear the question, but it was how can AI and Indigenous cultural teaching intersect?
I'm going to talk now about history and future because they're connected. So we know that Australia's Indigenous peoples are the world's first scientists, but there's some new scholarship around Indigenous women through the medium of weaving being the world's first computer coders. And it happens like this, from what I've been told from some incredible First Nations researchers. Weaving is a binary code of warp and weft. The warp and weft go under each other, like knitting with knit 1 and purl 2. So a lot of the scholarship now is around how with AI we need to bring it back to First Nations people and really break it down that this is where it belongs. But with regards to future, a lot of Indigenous researchers are using AI in drones to care for country because it saves people having to walk all of that country to look at species, at flora and fauna, to see how country is thriving, particularly after bushfires and things like that. So there's a lot of opportunity for AI to be embedded in caring for country. So I hope that helps and answers your question. Great question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you back. Any more questions? Yes.
Just whether you have any comments in your book around healthcare. I'm in the natural medicine, which is very feminine, very wise woman, against the patriarchal modern medicine. And we've seen the last few years some interesting events around coercion and so on. Just have you any further comments about where that might go?
There's a whole chapter on medical misogyny because historically men's bodies have been used for research and that's been transposed onto women's bodies again because they're exactly the same. And assumptions have been made and people have died, and that continues to this very day. I mean, last year I was either in bed or a wheelchair with long COVID, and part of the reason why we don't understand more about long COVID is it's basically ME/CFS, myalgic encephalomyelitis / chronic fatigue syndrome, which impacts, I think it's 80% women, 75 to 80% women, and it just hasn't been researched enough. The other aspect of health and hospitals that I found fascinating and horrifying is the ageism. Because there are so few ventilators, especially right in the thick of the pandemic and COVID, if you went to a hospital and you were 55, turning 56 in a couple of weeks like me, and there was a 30-year-old and there was only one ventilator, they would give it to the 30-year-old because they're seen as more productive to society. So there's a whole bunch of discrimination that's built in through what's called these Frankenstein data sets in hospitals and in healthcare. And a lot of it is to do with the fact that doctors have traditionally and predominantly been male. I promise I'm going to wrap up. I'll just tell one more very brief story.
We're here to hear you talk, man. Just keep going.
Thank you, sister. There's this thing called a pulse oximeter. I don't know whether any of you have used it. I had to use it last year with long COVID. And it measures the level of oxygen in your blood, and it's a life or death thing. If it gets below a certain number, you must call an ambulance and get to a hospital immediately. So I was constantly looking at it on my finger. When I was researching my book, I discovered that this thing had been on the market for 15 years, and they knew that it was wrong for people of colour.
Why?
Because it's a light sensor thing going into the finger and it reflects off the skin, and it hadn't been tested properly, if at all, on people of colour. So you would have to be sicker to get care in hospital unless you're a white person. So there's all of this. In fact, Amy Non, one of the researchers I quote in the book, said there is so much racism and sexism built into the medical profession that dates back to slavery days. It is absolutely appalling, and this is being embedded even deeper by the technology.
You mentioned you had long COVID last year. How are you feeling now?
Oh, thank you for asking. I am about 85% better. I'm so relieved, and part of that, this wonderful woman drove from Balmain to the Northern Beaches repeated times to deliver beautiful homemade meals, and honestly each time it was enough to feed my family for a month. So how about a round of applause for the nicest person on the planet, Yumi Stynes.
The reason I brought up the COVID was because I just wanted to say to Tracey that you did a huge effort on a personal scale to get the book written. And we are so grateful to you for being here tonight. So could you please thank the heroic Tracey Spicer?
I just want to say say something briefly? Look, thank you so much. It's been such a joy to be in conversation with you. You are a national treasure and such a wonderful friend and a beautiful human and a fabulous feminist. How about a big round of applause for Yumi Stynes? I'd like to thank all you for coming. This is the most beautiful, nurturing group, and a special shout out to Emma and Anna from Simon & Schuster, who saw my vision years ago when no one else could, and you both totally get it. You've supported this book, you've championed it, you've both been incredible. I cannot thank you enough.
And everybody here, you can buy copies of the book. There are a few copies of a few books I've written here tonight. Tracy will be signing. Just politely pointing out that given the long COVID situation, no hugging or kissing of Tracy tonight. I know you want to. But also if you're watching at home, you can pop into Roaring Stories, an independent bookstore, and buy copies of Tracy's book, Man-Made there. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Yumi. And can I ask you also, please, to give another round of applause? Tracey Spicer.